you. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to see so many of you when you could be outside enjoying the nice weather. Instead, let's talk about inequality and non-standard work. Let me just start a little bit of why are we discussing this topic and why is the OECD interested in such a topic. And unlike some of the lectures that have been here on inequality and growth, where there's a long-standing tradition on what are the links, is inequality affecting growth, is growth affecting inequality, there hasn't been so much research on this topic. This is something that has come in recent years. And the reason why we thought it was interesting to look at this was that in the past we saw that there was, when you look at household income, we've seen large increases in inequality in terms of household income. And the main driver of this is what is actually happening in the labor market, what is happening to labor earnings, because this is the largest component of income. And we also saw that one big driver of this changes in inequality was technological change. Another big driver was what was happening in terms of institutions, in terms of the labor market institutions, in terms of employment protection legislation, in terms of unemployment benefits, and other institutional changes that happened in the past 20 to 30 years. We saw that such institutional changes, they had led to, on the one hand, increased employment, but on the other hand, they were accompanied by a rise of earnings inequality. So we thought it would be interesting to go deeper into what's happening in terms of the labor market, and in particularly of the issue of non-standard work, because we wanted to know, is it the reason that we've seen increases in employment? Is it because most of this employment is in the form of non-standard work? Are these, in a way, poor jobs, low-paid jobs that have been created in the past years up to the crisis? And are these earnings inequality driven by these gaps between the non-standard and the standard workers, or is there something else going on that is driving this earnings inequality? But to know that, we also needed to look first, what is non-standard work? Are they really paying less? Are there traps, or are there stepping stones? Are people moving from these jobs, or are they staying in there? And this is one thing to look at the individual level, but how does this affect the household level? Are these people living together with people who are not working? Are they like kind of clustered together? Because in the past we had seen that there was a rise in inequality at the household between households where everybody was working and they were earning and had much better lives, and the people who were both not working. But is it also the same for the working poor? Are they kind of concentrated into, or is there the household circumstances that matter? So these were the range of areas we were interested in. What we've been looking at, and this is coming in a forthcoming publication that for May 21st, among other things that were mentioned, is first, what is the share of non-standard work? What are the trends? How has it contributed to employment growth, and are jobs polarizing? But also, what are the labor market's prospects of non-standard workers? Are they lower paid? Are there stepping stones? And how does it affect overall inequality in terms of earnings? And then looking at the household level. And looking at the household implies looking at the distributional position, but also looking at poverty and the role of taxes and benefits. So in terms of what is non-standard or atypical work, and we call it a sort of fuzzy concept. There's no clear definition, although several organizations in the past, they've looked at this. And the way we tried to define it was driven by data issues, but also by country-specific issues. And we decided to define it in its broadest term, so by looking at what it was not. So looking at the opposite of full-time permanent employment, or full-time employment with an indefinite contract. And this includes people who are self-employed, who own their own business. This includes also part-time employees, and it also includes people in temporary contracts. And what we see here is that the concepts, they can be also very blurry, particularly in certain countries or for certain categories. If we take the concept of self-employed work, in some countries there's been changes in that. And the definition or the boundary between being a self-employed on-account worker and working for a company can become very blurry. And particularly this is a way that firms have found to reduce costs or to reduce, to simplify the administration in certain cases. So basically these are employees who are self-employed, but they're still working for the same company. And they have a long-standing relation with this company. So they keep on working for the same company years and years, but they're not on their payroll. You also have a great deal of heterogeneity in what is non-standard work. For instance, when we talk about temporary work, we have people who are in a fixed-term contract, typically 1-2 years contract. But you also have people who are seasonal contracts, like in agriculture, or people who work in construction and they work the time they are doing this work. There are also people who work for a temporary work agency, and in a way they are temporary because they work for a temporary work agency, so they keep on changing every time they go to a different firm, maybe every week or so. But actually they're been working with this temporary work agency for years and years. So are they temporary or they're permanent? So as you can see, it's a very blurry concept sometimes, and it's very heterogeneous. Now, what is the share of non-standard work across the OECD? What we can say is that it's a sizable proportion. About a third of the workforce is in non-standard work within the OECD. And we have roughly an equivalent proportion between the part-time, the temporary, and the self-employed. They make about 1/3 of this third, so 10–11% each. And there's quite a great deal of diversity here. There are countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland where 50% or even 60%, that is the majority of the workforce, are actually non-standard workers. So you can also question whether these are non-standard, since they make most of the workforce. But on the other hand, you have more the Estonia, Slovenia, where 20%, 15% are non-standard workers. So the most people are still in full-time permanent jobs. There's also quite a great diversity across the OECD in terms of the share of each component. So you have countries like Greece, Turkey, but also Italy, where self-employment is actually the majority or a great share of the non-standard workers. You have countries like Poland, Spain, where temporary is the most important components. And then you have countries like the Netherlands, but also Nordic countries, where part-time is the most important share of non-standard work. Now, who are the people in non-standard work? Given the large percentage of part-time in some countries, it's not surprising that women are overrepresented in non-standard work. So about 60% of non-standard workers tend to be women. If you exclude the part-timers, then we're reaching 40%, as there are also more men among the self-employed in many countries. We also have youth. They're overrepresented in temporary employment, and the incidence of non-standard work is quite high among youth. About 40% of youth are in temporary in non-standard employment, and about 60% when you take into account temporary. There's also a large incidence of non-standard work among the low skilled and people in lower occupation groups, and they're also among small firms. What happens in terms of the dynamics? How has this changed over time? As you may see here, there's been a small change, but the change is not so apparent. If we compare back to the 1985, we see that between 1985 and 95, there's about 2 percentage point growth, and another about 2 percentage point growth since 95. So there's an increase, but it's not dramatic when we look at it. Yet again, it depends on the country you're looking at. So there are countries like the Netherlands, Germany, where the increase has been very large. We're talking about 20 percentage point increase in the Netherlands. You have countries, some Nordic countries, where there's actually been a decline, mainly due to a reduction in part-time employment over time. And there are countries where there's been a sort of increase up to the 90s and then a decline, like Spain, although part of it is driven by the economic crisis. So it doesn't look very alarming. However, when we look at how this is in terms of overall jobs being created, this is a very large chunk. If we look at the crisis, up to the crisis period, so 95, 2007, we see that about 40% of all jobs being created in the OECD are actually in the form of non-standard work. A large share are actually temporary, but also part-time plays a role. And here, what you see is that temporary employment has increased in almost 3/4 of OECD countries. Part-time employment has also grown in about a half or 2/3 of OECD countries. Self-employment is more or less stable in terms of numbers. There's a decline in most countries, but there are countries where we see a growth, and it's this phenomenon of what we call this false self-employment, where employers and sometimes employees, for tax reasons, for administrative reasons, they move to become self-employed in certain sectors. But so this has happened, for instance, in the Slovak Republic. But generally, self-employment in terms of numbers hasn't varied very much. Then what we see is during the crisis, a large reduction, a large fraction of the reduction is actually in the form of standard jobs. But in some countries, again like Spain, but also other countries, Finland, there's a large reduction in people in temporary employment during the crisis. But what we see during the crisis is that part-time has continued to grow in most countries. So when you compare the overall 95 to 2013, because of this job creation among the part-times, you see that almost 60% of overall jobs during this period are actually coming from non-standard employment. Now we also, there's a discussion in recent years of what is called job polarization. And the idea here is that jobs are disappearing in the middle of the earnings distribution, and they are increasing at both ends of the distribution. And here we try to look at this by categorizing jobs into three categories: the abstract, which are in a way high-skilled and generally more higher-paid jobs; what we call the routine or middle skill jobs and the non-routine manual jobs, which are usually at the end of this distribution. And there are jobs where you don't need specific skills, but they cannot be replaced by machines or workers outside of OECD countries, as you see in the routine jobs, because you need the presence of such workers. And what you see is that across the board, there's been a decline in the middle skill jobs, the middle paying jobs, and there's an increase. There's a large increase in the abstract or the high paid jobs, but also in the non-routine manuals. And this is something you see more or less in all countries. And why are we interested in this and in the relation with non-standard work? Is because when we look at the type of jobs and how they are changing, what we see in the when we look at the bottom panel, the routine task, everything is in white. So all of the jobs that are disappearing, the middle in the middle of the distribution of earnings and skills, they're actually in the form of standard work, and that happens more or less across all the countries. At the same time, when we see the jobs that are being created in terms of the lower end of the distribution, the non-routine manual, most of them, the large chunk of them, they're actually non-standard jobs. And in terms of the abstract, about half are actually being in terms of standard and half in terms of standard, non-standard jobs. Although what you see is that in some countries, actually all of the abstract jobs are also in the form of non-standard. This is the case, for instance, in Italy, but also in Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany. This doesn't necessarily mean that non-standard, jobs are actually pushing towards this polarization, but the discussion is more whether technological change accompanied by changes in institutions and employment protection legislation are actually contributing to polarizing the job distribution and also the type of jobs. Now we move to the other part. We've looked at what is non-standard job and the trends, and now we want to look at whether these jobs are actually indeed of lower quality or not, and what impact it has on the overall earnings distribution. So in terms of the pay, we've looked at both annual earnings, but then you have an issue, the temporary, they might not work throughout the year. So yes, they pay less, but are we comparing the same things? The part-timers, they also work less hours, so how can we figure out if they're really earning less? So we look at hourly wages. And we look at median hourly wages, and here we compare. So our benchmark one is what a standard worker would earn, and what you see is that pretty much everything is below one, meaning that they, even in terms of hourly wages, they all earn less. And this is the difference is a bit smaller for the part-time permanent workers, who earn about 80% of what the standard worker would earn per hour, but we are about 70% for temporary, either full-time or part-time. And you see in certain countries the difference is much smaller. We are closer to 10%. But there are countries where we are getting to 60% or even below of what a standard worker would earn. Now the question is, are they earning less because simply we've already seen that they have different characteristics, so they tend to be more women, they're younger. I mean, when you're younger, you just tend to earn less, and then your pay grows as you move up the ladder. Are you working in different occupations? So we try to control for individual and job characteristics in terms of age, education, and occupation. And we still find that the temporary workers, they face a penalty in terms of hourly wages. So they still earn about 12% less. And even if we control for other characteristics that we cannot see, that are individual and they're fixed over time, there's still like a penalty of about 5 to 8% depending on the country. And this penalty is still tends to be higher for younger workers. And there's usually, we don't see a large difference between men and women, except in some countries such as Greece, where the penalty tends to, or Ireland, where it tends to be higher for women. Now, in terms of the part-time workers, when we look at hourly wages and we control for the other characteristics, we still see a penalty mainly for men, but also for the people who are in part-time temporary. When we look at the part-time permanent in terms of hourly wages, the differences, they tend to disappear. And we even have a country like Australia where there tends to be a part-time premium. That means that per hour worked, they earn more, particularly women in Australia. Now, how does this affect the overall earnings distribution? So this shows you what the wage penalty is for non-standard worker at different points of the distribution. So from the bottom 10% to the 90%. And the black bar is the median wage penalty. And the two circles are like the penalty at the extremes. And what you see is that the penalty to non-standard employment tends to be greater at the bottom of the distribution. So we're talking about 18 to 24% penalty in between 10 in the bottom 40 of the distribution. And as you move up to the earnings distribution, this penalty disappears. This means that if non-standard work increases, there's an increase in the share of people at the bottom of the distribution. There's an increased penalty at in the lower part of the earnings distribution, but not at the top, and this would tend to increase earnings inequality overall. So now, what happens in terms of other characteristics of job quality for these workers? So one of the big difference between the non-standard workers and the standard workers is on the level of training, because overall they tend to get a much less training on a yearly basis than the non-standard workers. Also, temporary workers, they tend to face more what is called job strain, so they have more demands and less support from their colleagues. And this is not necessarily the case for the part-timers, but overall, the temporary, they have less training, they have more job strain. So they pay less. For the temporary jobs, they pay less, they have more demands, and they have less training. Does it compensate? To a certain extent it does, in the sense that if you were to stay unemployed instead of having a temporary job, you're much less likely to move to a full-time permanent job. Or looking at the other way, what we look is that we look at people and we look at their job status in the previous year, and we look at the probability they were to be in a full-time permanent job in the next year. And what we see is that if you had a temporary job, you're about 12 to 13 points more likely to move into a full-time permanent job than if you were to stay unemployed. Now, this is not necessarily the case for the part-timers. It depends on the countries. The question is whether the part-timers can actually be considered a stepping stone, because there's a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of part-timers. For some people, part-time is really a stepping stone, is the first job that you get. Or there's also women who have stopped working, then they get a part-time job that would help them. But for other, part-time is actually, there's a high retention into part-time. People make the choice for work-life balance and they tend to stay. So in some countries, it actually decreases the probability that you move into a standard job. And similarly, the self-employed, that actually is associated with a negative probability. So you're more likely to move into a standard job if you were unemployed than if you were into self-employment. Now, in terms of the worker characteristics, it's a little bit mixed. We were kind of, our expectations was that these jobs would be more stepping stones for the young. But this is not necessarily the case. We don't find that the probability that they move into a standard job is higher if they're younger. And also we don't see any effect of skill level. It's very mixed across the countries. What we also look at the other part of the effect. So in a way, job insecurity tends to be higher for this type of jobs. So temporary employment is associated with a higher risk of unemployment in the next year than a standard job. And similarly, the part-timers and the self-employed, they have a much higher risk of inactivity than if they were in a standard job. Now, how does this affect the household income inequalities and poverty? The answer to this depends on several factors. We've seen that particularly for the temporary, they tend to earn less at the individual level, and this is associated with higher earnings inequality. But how does this translate in terms of the household dimension? Depends on demography. Are these workers living alone? Are they living with other non-standard workers? Are they living with standard workers? And it also depends on the earnings. I mean, if non-standard workers, they earn less, but this represents a very small fraction of the overall earnings in the household, the impact on inequality at the household level would be small. Similarly, when we move from earnings to income, there are other things that are to be taken into account. Particularly, it is possible that non-standard workers, they benefit, they actually receive more benefits. And therefore then their income is compensated. So we need to look at all these different factors to see how it affects inequality at the household level. So we first started by looking at what is the distribution at the household level, and we saw that about 40% of households have actually a non-standard worker. And when we look at which percentage of non-standard workers were main earners, about half of them were actually the main earners in the household. And this depended also on the type of work they were doing. So the self-employed were much more likely to be main earners, and the part-time, they were much less likely. And also in terms of the countries, often the percentage of non-standard workers who were main earners was much more important in countries such as Greece, where there was a large share of the self-employed. We also see that when we look at this non-standard workers, about half of them are actually having children. So it's not individuals who are living alone, even though we've seen a large fraction of the youth. But there's a lot of households, couples with children, and also single parents who are in non-standard work and who are the main earners. Now, in terms of the overall earnings of the household, here our benchmark, the one, represents what a household with only one standard worker would have. And what you see is that single parents, single people, and households where there's only one earner but in non-standard work, they earn much less, also at the household level. But what is more surprising is that we see that in many countries, the households where you have two people in non-standard work, they earn about the same as the same household where there's only one earner in standard work. And particularly we see countries like Canada and Ireland where actually even households where you have two non-standard workers, they earn much less than a household where there's only one person in standard work. Of course, this is very different when you have this combination of one standard worker and non-standard worker, where they, on average, they earn 50% more. So, the type of combination matters. So you see that there's a much higher risk of low earnings at the household level when you have two people in non-standard work. While having a standard worker and non-standard worker is often associated with being better off in terms of earnings. Now, how does this affect inequality? We look at it in terms of looking at the overall Gini coefficient, which is a standard measure for inequality. And what we see is it reflects a little bit the picture before, is that if we look at the level of inequality when we just have standard workers, and then we compare with including the households where we have one in standard work and one in non-standard work, the level of inequality tends to decline a little bit. So just 1 point of Gini. Now, once we include households where everybody's in non-standard work, or there's non-standard workers and people who are out of a job, this increases by about 4 points of Gini. Of course, inequality increases much more once you include the jobless, but the impact of including the non-standard workers is quite important on the overall level of inequality. And this is even more important in countries such as Spain, where there's a large fraction. So the increase once you include the non-standard workers is much higher. Now, at the same time, what we see is that your position in the distribution changes, and this is so this is the percentage of people who were at the bottom of the distribution in terms of individual earnings. And what we see is that about a third of them, they remain, a third to 40%, they remain at the bottom when we look at household income. So the rest is kind of moving up once you take the earnings and the other factors at the household level. So because of this, and because non-standard work still makes a small share of earnings, it explains a small percentage of overall inequality at the household level. So we've seen that they earn less, but because of their overall fraction in terms of the household income is small, what we see is that non-standard work at the moment only explains about 20% of overall inequality at the household level. The big chunk of inequality comes actually from inequality within the standard workers. This is a little bit higher in some countries like Australia. About 30% is explained by non-standard work, but there's still a big part of the inequality at the household level is coming from inequality among standard workers. However, the impact on poverty is much more substantial. So if you look at the poverty rates at the household level, and here we define poverty by looking at the median of the distribution and households that earn 50% below this. And we see that non-standard work households, they have poverty rates which are just over 20%. However, when we look at households where there are only standard workers, their poverty rate is about 2%. And this is similar to households where you have a combination of standard and non-standard workers. What is also interesting is that you have certain countries where non-standard work is associated with a high risk of poverty and is very comparable to poverty where there's nobody working. And this is, for instance, the case of Greece, but also in Luxembourg, where the poverty rates for such households are fairly similar. And also we see that the non-standard workers, they represent an important fraction of the working poor. So here we look at the job characteristics of households. And what you see is that about 55% are jobless households, but the rest are actually, the rest of the poor are actually at work. And when you look at those people who are at work, more than 60% of them are actually in non-standard work households. And finally, we look at the role of taxes and benefits in this. And this is the reduction of poverty that is associated with taxes and transfers. And we compare it with non-standard work, and we compare with the jobless household. So this is by how much your poverty risk is, declines when you include taxes and transfers. And we see there's still a substantial amount, so about a third of poverty is actually reduced by taxes and transfer. But when we compare with jobless household, about 50%, taxes and transfer reduce about 50% of this poverty risk. And we actually see, particularly the for the Southern European countries, the impact of taxes and transfers on poverty for the non-standard work is quite small. There's even the case where there's no change, or it even increases once you factor in taxes and transfers. And so what we are seeing is that when we look at the public policies in this respect, we see that non-standard workers, they do not always benefit from the same taxes and transfers as other workers. In particular, there is statutory difference with respect to self-employed. In many countries, they are not, they are excluded from unemployment benefits. They also have no eligibility to work injury benefits, and there are differences in the rules for sickness and maternity benefits. And the self-employed contributions are also larger than the employee contributions for the self-employed. The self-employed, they have different entitlements to taxes and benefits because of their particular work characteristics. For the part-timers, it's a little bit different. It's not necessarily that they have different entitlements, but their differences are mainly coming due to circumstances, but they're still better protected against poverty than the self-employed. So usually the reasons why you might have more part-timers in poverty is because it might be simply be associated with the fact that they work lower hours, not necessarily the fact that they are not entitled to certain benefits. And we see that still the taxes and benefits, they reduce the poverty gaps of the workers. But they're more effective because of this reason of reducing poverty gaps for the part-timers than for the self-employed workers. Now there's been quite a lot of material here. So what is it that you should take away from this presentation? What you should remember is that employment has increased, and it represents non-standard jobs have increased, and they represent about 1/3 of employment, and about 40% or more of households, they include non-standard workers. And on some measures of job quality, non-standard workers are worse off, particularly in terms of wages. They are 20 or 30% lower, and job insecurity is higher. And overall household earnings are also lower once you take into account non-standard work. Up to 40% lower if there's a non-standard worker. Now there's a stepping stone effect for the temporary workers, but as we've seen, it depends. So there is for the temporary workers, but not necessarily for part-time and the self-employed. And there are trade-offs. So the temporary, they tend to earn less, although this increases their chances of getting a full-time job, but they also have more job strain and lower training. And they also have more earnings instability. And the prospects, they also differ for depending on the type of non-standard workers. With the prime age and older workers, they're actually facing better chances as a stepping stone. In addition, earnings from non-standard work are distributed more unequally, and low-earning non-standard workers are likely to be at the bottom of the household income distribution, but the household circumstances matter. So they tend to be at the bottom if they are with other non-standard workers. However, if they are living with standard workers, their chances of being at the bottom are actually reduced, and they're quite small. And this also affects the risk of poverty. So the risk of poverty is not necessarily associated with non-standard work, but is with the combination of non-standard workers living together or with people who are not working. So thank you.